Well, another great friend of many years who gets a huzzah and my hat is Ron Fuchs II. Ron is senior curator of the Reeves Collection of Ceramics at Washington and Lee University, where he's worked for the last 13 years. He's another graduate of the College of William and Mary and the Winterthur program in early American material culture at the University of Delaware, and worked at Winterthur for 10 years prior to moving to the Reeves Museum. He's a past president and chair of the American Ceramics Circle and co-editor of Ceramics in America. And today, his presentation is All My Coat of Arms China, Armorial Ceramics in America. Please welcome Ron Fuchs.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Of course, I think like all of you, I wish we could be in person and all sharing a Sazerac or something and enjoying the hospitality of New Orleans. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy my talk. Before I get started, I'd like to give some thanks to Angela Howard, Suzanne Hood, Angelica Kuttner, Bly Straub, Mary Outlaw, and Rob Hunter, who helped me with some images and some of the information that I'll be sharing. So with no further ado, oops. In December of 1801, Dr. Moore Fauntleroy of Richmond, Virginia, wrote in his will that, quote, I give and bequeath to my nephew, Henry S. Turner, all my coat of arms, China. Now, Fauntleroy was almost certainly referring to the Chinese export porcelain service decorated with the Fauntleroy coat of arms, of which you see a rather damaged example here. The service had probably been made for his father, William Fauntleroy, around 1755. Now, in commissioning armorial porcelain and leaving it to his descendants as an heirloom, the Fauntleroys were part of a group of individuals across the Atlantic world who demonstrated their family's heritage, wealth, status, and identity through objects decorated with their coats of arms and other personalized insignia. Coats of arms were a way of satisfying what is probably a universal human desire to commemorate oneself and one's ancestors. They were a visual symbol of one's identity, of one's family history and status. And they signaled to viewers that the bearer, or at least the bearer's forebearers, had achieved a certain level of social, political, or economic standing. Coats of arms were a necessary accessory for any individual who was claiming membership in the aristocracy or gentry classes. And they helped establish and reinforce claims of gentility, status, and authority. Even if newly granted, a coat of arms conveyed a sense of antiquity or patina to a family, which was especially important in a hierarchical society where one's birth was an important indicator of one's place in society. Now, before we really kind of delve into the armorial ceramics, just to give a brief overview of the history of coats of arms and how to understand and decipher them. Coats of arms emerged in Europe around the year 1150, partly as a way of identifying knights in battle, and partly as part of jousting tournaments, a stylized form of mock combat that was a major spectator sport in Europe during the Middle Ages. Arms were used by knights in much the same way that sports teams use emblems, colors, and mascots today, as a form of identification and group solidarity and pride. On the screen right now, you're seeing a jousting check or scorecard for a joust that was held in 1520 at a meeting between Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. And you see their respective royal arms at the top of the pages and the arms of the knights participating in the tournament below. Now, though originally born just by knights, the appeal of a coat of arms as a personal symbol spread throughout society. And by the mid-1500s, Coats of arms were being used by members of the aristocracy, the gentry, and the growing ranks of wealthy professionals and merchants, what today we would probably classify as the middle, the upper middle, and the upper classes. Now, while coats of arms were used throughout Europe, Britons were especially noted for their love of heraldry and their penchant for decorating their possessions, especially their silver with coats of arms. And the reasons for this are not fully understood, but it likely reflects the existence of a powerful aristocracy and gentry, the growth of a large professional and merchant classes, and the increasing prosperity of Britain in the late 17th and 18th century. And what was true in the British Isles is also going to be true in British North America, and then to a lesser degree in other European colonies in North America. Now, British society and European society in general in the 17th and 18th centuries was rather fluid. We might not kind of think of that today when we look back in time, but there were many avenues for advancement for smart and ambitious individuals who were making their fortunes through global trade, through colonization, through professions like law or medicine, or military or government service, or making these connections through marriage. Now, Brooke Watson was just such a person. And here you see Brooke. He's the man in the water, not wearing any clothes, looks like he's about to be eaten by a shark. Now, as a young man, Brooke Watson lost his right leg in a shark attack in Havana, Cuba, an attack that was made famous by the American painter John Singleton Copley, which you see here. Now, most of us who might have seen this painting or be familiar with it, probably think this is the end of Mr. Watson, but in fact, he survived the shark attack, did lose his leg, and he went on to become a wealthy and influential merchant and politician back in England, serving as a member of Parliament and Lord Mayor of London. Now, though Brooke Watson claimed that he was, quote, of a very good family, he lacked a coat of arms. And so he got one, probably in 1803 when he was made a baronet. Now, Brooke Watson's arms are full of imagery referencing his youthful misadventure. The crest of the coat of arms is Neptune, the god of the sea. The motto underneath translates as "under God's protection," reflecting his miraculous survival. And his now lost right leg is commemorated in the small canton or field on the upper left. Now, Watson would have worked with a herald, an officer of the College of Arms, which was the government agency responsible for granting coats of arms, to design his coat of arms and to get it registered. These officers are known as heralds, and thus the use of the term heraldry to describe coats of arms. Now, the College of Arms continues to exist, and it's operated at least since the 1300s, recognizing people who've arrived at a certain level of status. And like I said, it still exists today, and you can apply, if you are of British ancestry, you can apply to get a grant of a coat of arms. And one of their most recent recipients is Meghan Markle, who was granted a coat of arms in 2018. And like Brooke Watson's, her arms are full of symbolic imagery. So the blue field represents the Pacific Ocean, the poppies and sun rays, her home in California, and the quill pens the power of communication, referencing her acting and blogging career. And so here you see her arms impaled, more about that later, with those of her husband, Prince Harry. Now, contrary to popular belief, coats of arms are not granted to a family, but rather they're granted to an individual and can legitimately be used only by that individual and their direct descendants. So people with the same last name can and often do have different coats of arms. Now, befitting their knightly origins, the main elements of a coat of arms, which are a shield, a crest, which is an ornament that sits on top of the helmet, and a motto or a battle cry, are all somewhat military in nature. These elements are decorated themselves with different symbols and different colors, whose arrangement is known as the blazon. And each of these is going to be distinct and and unique to that individual. And so here you see George Washington's coat of arms with a shield, a crest, and a motto. Now, the terms crest and coat of arms are not interchangeable. Let me repeat that, they're not interchangeable. And so when you're referring to a crest, you're really only referring to that little ornament that sits on top of the shield. And while shields and crests can be used on their own as a decorative element, they're all part of a coat of arms. And so you're not going to have one without all of those. Now, deciphering the symbols that make up a coat of arms can reveal not only the identity of the bearer of that coat of arms, but also can tell us their gender, their marital status, and in some cases, their ancestry. And so a man shows his coat of arms on a shield shape. And so here you see the shield shape, while a woman shows her coat of arms on what is called a lozenge or a diamond shape. Now, coats of arms being developed for a patriarchal society, women were not typically granted arms on their own, but rather would have used the arms of their fathers if they were unmarried, or of their husbands if they were married. Now, a married couple impales the arms of the husband and wife by dividing the shield in two and showing the man's arms on the viewer's left and the woman's arms on the viewer's right. And so this is a coat of arms that will only exist for the duration of that marriage. Now, in European and colonial American societies, especially in the upper classes, property tended to descend through the male line. And so daughters would have rarely inherited much of their parents' wealth. Now, the exception to this was if a daughter had no brothers. She was then known as a heraldic heiress, and her promise of greater wealth was shown by putting her arms in pretense, meaning in a small shield that was superimposed on top of her husband's shield. And so here you see the little gold and red shield that is on top of the white and black shield. The gold and red shield is Sarah Stevens' arms, and the black and white shield is her husband's, James West. Arms also show if a person is descended from a heraldic heiress, in which case they would integrate the heiress's arms into their own in a process known as quartering. And so this is a way of preserving the memory of a family whose male line has died out, and so whose surname is not going to be carried forward, but at least we've got that ancestry and that bit of that history preserved. Here you see a fairly simple quartered coat of arms made for the son of Hugh Cholmondeley and Catherine Wentworth. So you've got two coats of arms there, quartered, but you can add as many quarters as you need. And so if over the generations, a family would have made several advantageous marriages between men and heraldic heiresses, all of the arms of those heraldic heiresses would be included. And so you can get 4, 6, 8 different coats of arms depicted. Coats of arms also show if someone is a member of the true aristocracy. And so if they are a duke or an earl or a marquis, and also coats of arms can show in some cases what rank order the bearer is in, whether they are the first son or the second son or the third son. Coats of arms even can show if someone is illegitimate or descended from someone who was illegitimate. And you do that by placing a little blue and white bar that runs diagonally kind of across the shield. Now, of course, the only time you're really going to showcase that you are illegitimate or descended from someone who is illegitimate is if you're descended from the king or someone of kind of that level, which would, of course, have softened the embarrassment of the illegitimacy that might have taken place. Closely related to coats of arms are monograms and ciphers, and both are composed of the initials of the bearer. Monograms, like you see on the left, would have 2 or 3 letters that represent the first and last name of the person, or the first and last names of the husband and wife, and then their shared last name. To complicate things, sometimes when you have 3 letters, either the middle letter or the third letter can be the last name. Usually, if the last name is the middle letter, that middle letter will be elevated slightly to create sort of like a pyramid shape, but sometimes they're just run together. So sometimes that makes it hard to decipher. And ciphers, like you see on the right, are a complex interweaving of initials. And they are designed to be decorative, not really designed to be legible. So the cipher on the right, just trust me that is 2 interwoven W's for William Woodley. Now, coats of arms were an important part of European and colonial American visual culture from the 1100s into the 20th century, and they're still with us today. They were a mark of status and authority that was easily recognizable, even by those who did not understand or might not be steeped in the arcana of the laws of blazon, and could be found on a wide range of objects, large and small, both public and private. And so in 17th and 18th century and 19th century America, coats of arms would have been, and their components would have been everywhere. The royal coat of arms, or the government's coat of arms, were a mark of political and religious authority that would have been found on major public buildings. And so here you see examples from my home state of Virginia, on the Capitol building in Williamsburg, and the arms in the governor's palace in Williamsburg. A person's coat of arms would have been found on a wide range of their possessions, because again, if you are of a status that you have a coat of arms, you're not going to be shy about showing that. And the constant kind of repetition of that is going to help reinforce your place in society. So coats of arms would have decorated interior spaces. Here you see the parlor at Mount Vernon, and George Washington's coat of arms is carved over the fireplace, the most prominent space in the room. Coats of arms were especially common on silver, which would have been, sort of a necessary accompaniment to any table that had any, sort of pretensions to grandeur. And here you see a cruet set that belonged to Washington, and it's got his crest. That little ornament that sits on top of the shield is by itself on the caster, and the shield itself is by itself on the frame. Coats of arms were worked in needlework by daughters and wives of the gentry. They could be found on book plates, on correspondence, especially wax seals, on carriages. So as you're riding through town, everyone can tell, or at least understand, that the person in the carriage is not only rich enough to own a carriage, but sort of elevated enough to have a coat of arms. And even in death, coats of arms would have decorated someone's grave. Now, another type of possession that was often decorated with coats of arms were ceramics. Impressive and fashionable tablewares had been necessary props for fine dining from the 1400s onwards. And they were increasingly ornamented with coats of arms to reinforce their owner's status. Here you see some 15th and 16th century examples of Spanish lustreware and Italian maiolica. And here's an early 16th century Chinese porcelain example that's decorated with a coat of arms of Manuel I of Spain. One of the things that's going on here on this object, which was a ewer, and so that thing that looks like a little fishtail is actually the base of a now lost handle, and there would have originally been a spout that also has broken off. But the Chinese painters were, of course, not familiar with European heraldry, and so without clear instructions, they did not know which way was up on the shield of Manuel I, and so it was painted on the object upside down. Mistakes are not uncommon on armorial ceramics, which is hardly surprising considering that few potters, whether in Europe or Asia, many of whom may have been illiterate, would have had that sort of specialist knowledge that was necessary. Those mistakes from the past are both amusing to us today, but also help us kind of understand the process by which these things were commissioned and designed and produced. Now, coats of arms have been in North America since at least the settlement of Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and their cultural significance is hinted at by their prominence on the title page of Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame, of his General History of Virginia that was published in 1624. And you see the details of the coat of arms of the Virginia Company. And then you also see the arms of John Smith himself. His coat of arms, which you see on the right, is decorated with 3 Turks' heads, because one of John Smith's many kind of legendary exploits was during one of the wars he was involved in continental Europe. He evidently overpowered and decapitated 3 Ottoman soldiers, and those are commemorated there. Maps are often decorated with coats of arms of either the ruling monarch, the nation or state, or the colony that's depicted, or the company that organized the colony. And here is an early map of Louisiana with the arms of the Company of the West, also known as the Mississippi Company, which had a monopoly on French trade and colonization in the Americas in the early 18th century. Now, ceramics decorated with armorial achievements would have been prominent as well from the earliest years of European settlement in what's now the United States. So this jug was found in one of the buildings at James Fort in Jamestown. It was thought to have been built about 1608 and torn down by the 1620s. And it's emblazoned with the arms of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, after whom Virginia was itself named. Found nearby was the jug from which these fragments come, and they're decorated with the arms of Elizabeth's successor and Jamestown's namesake, James I. So both of these jugs, which would have been used to store and serve alcohol, would have been a very visible statement of their owners' patriotism and pride in their home country, in their monarchs, and in their new American endeavors. Now, it's easy to see why a gentleman or a lady at Jamestown would have wanted ceramics decorated with the English royal arms. It's somewhat less easy to understand the appeal of a piece like this. And the fragment on the left is from Jamestown. The piece on the right is an intact example. And it's decorated with the arms of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the very powerful and very Catholic empire that dominated Central Europe and was closely linked with England's bitter rival, Spain. And so you can think about Jamestown and Virginia, a colony founded by very Protestant Englishmen. Why do they have the symbol of a very Catholic ruler? But as Jamestown's former curator, Bly Straub, has pointed out, its associations with the status and the power of one of Europe's strongest empires may have overridden any anti-Catholic sentiment in the eyes of its owner. It's also quite important, and one of the things that we need to think about and always keep in mind when we're talking about objects is that objects move around. And especially when we're talking about the early modern period, the globalization, the trade, the transfer of people, both willing and unwilling, around the world is moving things all over the place. And so it's quite possible that this jug just simply was being valued in Jamestown and kind of ended up there through some kind of random, series of transportations, and was valued for sort of its size and utility and not its heraldic message. Another what I think is a great example of how exploration and emigration and trade and colonization were moving people around the world, and we're creating our modern interconnected world that brings objects places where they never probably were intended to be. Is this German stoneware jug. And it's decorated with the arms of the city in Amsterdam, which in the mid-17th century was one of the largest and richest cities in Europe. And it was linked by trade to Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas. And so ships from Amsterdam were going all over the globe. Objects from Amsterdam were going all over the globe. Objects, people, ideas from all over the globe were coming into Amsterdam. So the city's arms, which were seen as almost sort of a corporate logo by the city's merchants, went everywhere and were encountered by many different people. And so we can think about what they would have thought about an object like this, which a jug just like this one was found, ended up in Ganadagan, which was a Seneca village, Native American group in the Iroquois Nation in Western New York State in the 17th century. And so again, we can think about these objects moving around and being viewed by people who maybe didn't quite, didn't have any real connection with that original meaning, but would have taken on new meanings as exotic symbolic images that represent the wider world. In addition to German stoneware that was coming to colonial North America, Portuguese and Italian tin glazed earthenwares were coming in large quantities. And here you see fragments from both Virginia and Maryland decorated with coats of arms. Both are showing what in heraldic terms we would describe as a lion rampant. And the plate was found in Providence, Maryland. And these are thought to be the arms of Edward Lloyd, the first commander of the Providence settlement. Now, in the 17th century, the finest ceramics that would have been available in Europe and the Americas would have been Chinese porcelain, and its status only grew as specially commissioned Chinese porcelain services decorated with coats of arms and other personalized devices began to be produced at the turn of the 18th century. Now, we saw a much earlier example, that 1520s example with the Portuguese arms, but these really start to appear in, right around the year 1700. Now, Chinese armorial porcelain is incredibly rare in North America, and there's several reasons for this. One, Chinese porcelain of any type would have been expensive. Personalized, special order Chinese porcelain would have been even more so. And there would have been relatively few Americans who would have had the disposable income necessary to afford such luxuries that had no intrinsic value. If you had silver engraved with your coat of arms, if you got desperate, you could always melt down your silver or turn it in for cash. The second reason is that colonial America's position within the European mercantile empire, whether it's either Britain or France, left it at a disadvantage when procuring Asian goods. And so put simply, colonies, British and French North America would have existed to serve as a source of raw materials for the mother country and as a market for the mother country's goods. And so direct trade with China would not have been allowed between American colonies and China. And so therefore, all Asian goods that ended up in America before independence would have had to have come through Britain or France or the Netherlands first. So when we take a very broad look at armorial ceramics with an American collection, we can include things like this pair of jugs. This was made for John Hanbury and his wife, Anna Osgood. You can see, as I'm sure you will have remembered from our quick lesson, Anna Osgood's arms are in pretense on top of John Hanbury's, signaling that she was a heraldic heiress. Now, while the Hanburys lived in London and never set foot in America, the Virginia and Maryland colonies were the source of their wealth and status. John Hanbury was a tobacco merchant, and so all of his wealth came from trade with the Americas. The earliest armorial, Chinese armorial porcelain that I know of that would have been in America is the service we started with, the service that was made about 1755 for the Fauntleroy family. And again, it was probably commissioned by Colonel William Fauntleroy, who lived at Naylor's Hole in Richmond County in Virginia. Here you see a drawing of his, what would have been a very grand house by 18th century Virginia standards. Now, Fauntleroy's coat of arms had actually been granted to his grandfather, Moore Fauntleroy, in 1633. Moore Fauntleroy came to Virginia in 1643 and assembled an estate that assured his and his descendants would enjoy gentry status that their coat of arms suggested that they were entitled to. And so you see a drawing of the coat of arms on the left in the actual grant, and then you see the porcelain on the right. Now, we know that Colonel Fauntleroy, who we think commissioned this service, he was not shy about using his coat of arms. And while we have no direct documentation of him ordering an armorial service, he did order a seal for sealing wax, on his letters, pistol holsters, and even a carriage that he brought from London to Virginia, decorated with his coat of arms. And he instructed his agent in London to apply to the Fauntleroys in London, his cousins, or to the Herald's office for the design. And so it was probably through his London cousins that he ordered the service. Now, having personalized armorial porcelain would have put Moore Fauntleroy in a very rarefied group. And in fact, the only other person known to have had Chinese armorial porcelain in colonial North America before the American Revolution and independence was Virginia's royal governor himself, John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore. He served from 1771 to 1775, when he fled Williamsburg, the then capital of Virginia, in the middle of the night, abandoning his personal possessions, including the armorial dinner service you see here. Now, the reconstructed plate was excavated at his residence, the royal governor's palace, suggested that it was broken and discarded during his residency or possibly following his flight. At least 6 other pieces from his service have been found in other sites in Williamsburg, suggesting that after he left, his armorial service was sort of taken, and people took individual pieces kind of as souvenirs, suggesting that the significance that was placed on armorial porcelain as a representation of the owner. So this, of course, was not what John Murray had intended, that people would have seized his armorial dishes as a, sort of a stand-in for seizing himself, but that's kind of what seems to have happened. And here you see a reproduction of the service made by Commander Williamsburg, setting the table in the royal governor's palace, suggesting just what a kind of grand show it would have made. Now, such a heady mix of sort of wealth and status and exoticism would have proved irresistible to wealthy and status-conscious Americans after the Revolution, when direct trade between the new United States and China made commissioning armorial porcelain easier and cheaper. Now, there are some individuals who thought that coats of arms were undemocratic, and they seem to have stopped using them. But many Americans, including some of the founding fathers and other leaders, seem to find no inconsistency with their membership in a democratic society and these ancient symbols of inherited wealth and status. And I think kind of a perfect example of this is this broken sugar bowl, which was part of a service that was commissioned by Lieutenant James Giles, an artillery officer from the Continental Army. And he used the Giles family coat of arms, but then he balanced its symbolism of inherited wealth and status with an American flag, with a cannon, and with a new motto, Libertà e Patria Mia, which translates loosely as liberty in my country, to symbolize his pride in the new nation. Another example of an armorial service made for an American patriot is this large service that was made for Samuel Chase, a Maryland attorney who signed the Declaration of Independence and served as a Supreme Court justice. The coat of arms on the porcelain was actually based on one of his book plates, and the coat of arms was not his at all. And it was not even a Chase family coat of arms. It was his aunt's, a woman named Margaret Townley. But Samuel Chase did what many Americans did, who did not have a legitimate coat of arms, but who wanted the status of owning armorial objects. And so they adopted coats of arms of more illustrious relatives, or borrowed coats of arms from people of the same name, or simply made up coats of arms. Now, much of the Chinese armorial porcelain and much of the European armorial ceramics that were made for Americans were made for people who had connections with global trade that facilitated their ability to commission armorial ceramics. One example is Charles Izard Manigault of South Carolina. Though he was born into a wealthy plantation family, he began his career as a merchant, traveling to Asia between 1817 and 1823. And for at least part of that time, he was in China, and while there, he commissioned an armorial service for himself and for his brother. And the arms were based on his bookplate, which he had actually commissioned when he'd stopped in Australia en route to China. Manigault noted later in life that while in Australia, quote, "I also had engraved there my coat of arms, which are now pasted in the books in my library. They were engraved for me by one of those talented convicts who was too tricky at home to remain." Now, the quote, talented convict that he employed was Samuel Clayton, who had been convicted of forgery in England and had been banished to Australia, which was at that point a penal colony, where he continued to practice his trade as an engraver, but doing evidently more legitimate work by engraving coats of arms for passing merchants. I think you can just make out that Manigault adapted his coat of arms to include the crest of a Native American with a feathered headdress, bows and arrows. Again, I think to kind of symbolize that while he was part of the elite, he was part of the American elite. Now, for those Americans who didn't have a coat of arms, but who wanted the social status that came from having personalized porcelain, there were several options. You could actually apply for a coat of arms. You could borrow one from a relative like Samuel Chase did, or you could make one up entirely, which is what Elias Haskett Derby, who was quite possibly America's first millionaire, what he did. He commissioned a service decorated with a crest of the mythological figure of Hope, who stands there with her anchor. And so by using this, and you see his initials, EHD for Elias Haskett Derby up at the top. And so even though Derby was essentially new money, he could have the patina of status and ancestry by having these sort of pseudo armorial objects. And you could also use, if you weren't quite up to making up a coat of arms, you could also use your initials or other personal devices as a way of creating personalized objects. One example of the use of initials is a large and elaborate tea, coffee, and chocolate service bearing the monogram of Martha Washington that was commissioned in 1795 by the Dutchman Everardus van Boom Hoekgeest as a gift for Martha. And here you see her starburst. Her monogram is framed in a starburst and surrounded by a chain of states, each link inscribed with the name of one of the 15 states. So it's a symbol of strength through unity, with her initials in the center. Now, initials seem in the United States in the 19th century to become increasingly more popular. And I think this is possibly a reflection of more democratic ideals that would have downplayed these sort of old European symbols of inherited wealth and power. And so here you see a French porcelain service that was made in the mid-19th century for the Cherzet family of Cherry Grove Plantation in Natchez, an incredibly rich family whose wealth stemmed from their slave powered plantations, but who are personalizing their possessions in order to sort of enhance their status with their initial. The Bisland family, also of Natchez, chose to commemorate not their family, but rather their plantation, Mount Repose, on their French porcelain dinner service. So again, the cachet of having something that's personalized, that's something special ordered, but again, perhaps a bit more democratic, a bit more approachable than a formal coat of arms. Americans also sometimes chose not to use their personal coat of arms or initials, but rather coats of arms of organizations or the nation or states to signal their alliances or beliefs. The most famous example of which is a service that belonged to George Washington that bears the seal known as an eagle of the Society of the Cincinnati, which is an organization of Revolutionary War officers, of whom Washington was both a member and the president of the society. The society was named for Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, a Roman farmer turned military leader who served his country without expectation of reward or power, and was seen by many as the model of a selfless patriot. Washington, a farmer who led American troops to victory and then retired back to Mount Vernon, was seen as many as a modern day Cincinnatus. Washington bought this service in 1786. He paid a whopping $150 for the 302-piece service. That was an enormous amount of money at the time. We saw the silver earlier that belonged to Washington with his coat of arms. And I think Washington, who was nothing if not thoughtful about what messages his possessions sent about him, I think he chose to purchase this service as a way to signal that to his dinner guests that, like the mythical Cincinnatus, he too would serve his country without expectation of reward, and was not looking to create a sort of an inherited aristocracy. Now, Americans had long used patriotic emblems to show off their patriotism in their nation. And so from the late 1600s up until the Revolution, German stoneware mugs with the monograms of the monarch were a ubiquitous feature in middling and elite American households. And here you see the initials of George II, Georgius Rex, on this large mug from the early 18th century. As Americans changed from subjects to citizens, they simply changed their symbols, using the Great Seal of the United States to show their patriotism and pride. And here you see an example on a Chinese export porcelain two-handled chocolate cup. Many Americans balanced their patriotism and loyalty to the nation with their identification with their home state. And so here you see a creamware jug decorated with the arms of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, by the mid-19th century, armorial ceramics, like armorial objects altogether, had begun to fade from fashion in the United States as new styles, increased adherence to democratic values, and changing economic conditions led to a decline in their use. Monograms, which may, like I have said, have been seen as less elitist, seem to have continued to be favored. And here you see an example made as a gift for President Ulysses S. Grant in 1868 that combines his monogram with the then fashionable rose medallion pattern. But if armorial ceramics were no longer the luxury tableware that they had been, they assumed a new identity as a collectible antique, prized for their age, their exotic origins, and their associations with a romanticized past, as represented in this painting, A Lover of Old China. So members of the Fauntleroy family preserved even broken pieces of their ancestral service, even going so far as to frame them to create decorative objects that spoke to their family's former wealth and prominence. So armorial objects retained some of their value as a form of cultural capital, even if the family no longer controlled much economic or political capital. By the 19th and 20th century, the Fauntleroys had lost their estate. However, fine personalized tablewares have not disappeared completely. They continue to be deployed as a way of showing style, status, and authority. So should you dine at the White House, it's likely you would eat off one of the 20th century state dinner services, which are emblazoned with the arms of the office of the President of the United States. So what you're looking at now is the most recent service that was made for the Obamas, which mixes traditional elements such as the border, which was inspired by a service that had been made for President Monroe, and more modern elements, such as the bright blue color that was inspired by the waters of the Pacific around Barack Obama's home state of Hawaii. As is traditional for a state dinner service at the White House, the presidential arms appear on the first piece a guest would see, which would be the large gold-rimmed service plate, and then on the last piece that the guest would see, which would be the dessert plate and the coffee cup. Now, what interests me most about ceramics is what they can tell us about their makers, their users, and their collectors. All ceramics, like all objects in general, can tell us about these people, but armorial ceramics, so tied up in personal identity and self-presentation, are especially valuable in telling their stories. So I hope that this talk has helped you understand and hopefully appreciate armorial ceramics a bit better. Thank you.
The Historic New Orleans Collection would like to thank the French Antique Shop for its long-standing support of the Antiques Forum. Located at 225 Royal Street, the shop offers a selection of splendid 18th and 19th century European country and sophisticated furnishings. Learn more at gofrenchantiques.com.